Good evening, everybody. Welcome to those here in the room and to the people online. I think probably know who I am, but just in case, my name's Maura McGowan, and I'm the judicial member of the Board of Trustees of BAILII. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the 2024 Sir Henry Brooke Lecture. Sir Henry Brooke, as you will know, was the founding chair of BAILII's board 24 years ago. We're celebrating our 24th birthday. The lecture series was named in his honour because he was so passionately committed to access to justice and to the idea that the law should be freely available to all, including those who simply could not afford it. And what BAILII does now is it makes the law available to all, including some of you who probably can afford it. More later. I just wanted to take one moment to welcome the members of his family who are here tonight, his son Christopher and his wife Josephine and his daughter Caroline. You're very welcome. We're also grateful to A&O Shearman Sterling for hosting this evening's lecture and making it possible for all of you to join us here and online. This firm has a very long history of very generous support to the pro bono and charitable sectors, and we are grateful to them for facilitating this opportunity to bring together BAILII supporters from all around the world. I'm sure you wouldn't be here otherwise, I suppose, that you all know what BAILII does. But as I've said, it was a charity founded 24 years ago. The idea is that it promotes and promulgates the rule of law by providing free access to online case law, legislation, and all other legal materials. Currently, the BAILII website includes over 130 databases of material from 14 jurisdictions, including the 4 home nations, Ireland, other countries in Europe, and all around the world. As of mid-November this year, BAILII's free resources included more than 500,000 searchable cases and almost 160,000 items of legislation. It uploads about 500 judgments a week. Our newest database, and they're very welcome, are judgments from the Singapore International Commercial Court, which has enhanced our ability to provide international commercial judgments to our users. Now, there are undoubtedly other sources of free judgments online, but BAILII continues to provide an essential free-to-access resource that covers multiple jurisdictions, includes, as I say, hundreds of thousands of judgments, has a deep collection of material pre-2001, and some very, very, very old historical judgments going way back. It doesn't use cookies, it doesn't use trackers, and we've had, I think last year it was 5 million users. Up until the beginning of this month, this year, it's been 119 million times that BAILII is used, all for free. Now, of course, it's free. It's like the National Health. It's free at the point of access, but it's not free to provide. And we need the funds from the generous sponsors and donors to continue to be able to provide this service. We rely on that generosity. Many of you are here from firms or institutions or sets of chambers that have given generously in the past. Thank you, but please carry on. What we provide isn't simply for the legal profession, isn't simply for the academic world. It's available to students who simply don't have the resources to finance their own research. It's available to those many people who conduct their own litigation because they don't have the resources to find legal assistance through any other means. So it's an essential and valuable service. As I say, we're grateful to those of you who've already given. We wish that those of you who have already given continue to give. And if you haven't yet started, we've locked the door. So this evening's event is going to run as follows. I'm going to stop in a minute. You'll be very relieved to hear. I'm going to hand over to our distinguished speaker. At the end of her lecture, there will be a question and answer session, and then you will hear from Guy Beringer, the chair of the Board of Trustees. Now, quite clearly, Helena Kennedy needs no introduction. You will have seen, those of you who noticed the information about her biography on the screen outside, the list of remarkable achievements. We've worked out over the course of preparing for tonight's lecture, she has 42 honorary degrees. Pretty good stuff. She was in most of the leading cases during her time in full-time practice. She spent 25 years in the House of Lords, pushing and pushing and pushing for equal opportunities, equal rights, and enhanced rights for women here and around the world. I was involved in helping some of the Afghan women judges who had to leave Afghanistan very quickly when the government fell. And we had a little network of women judges here, about a dozen of us, who were doing, we thought, really well, actually. And we got help to some of the judges, we got them sponsorship when they got here. And I thought we'd done really well until I spoke to Helena, who produced a black book like you have never seen. Now, I know people who can pick up a phone and will help. She knows people who've got aeroplanes. And the work that she did to help some of those women physically get out of Kabul at a time when their lives were on the line was quite extraordinary. It is but one example of the work she's done and the way that she's been a constant advocate for change. I should also record that we're extremely grateful to her for coming along this evening. She's literally got out of her sick bed to come and join us. So if her voice is a bit croaky, we will all forgive her. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. In particular, thank you to Helena.
Oh, that was lovely. Thank you, Maura. Maura, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I have been introduced as Helena Kennedy, the lawyer who represents women and other criminals. So it's nice to be given a sort of a different intro. And it's lovely to see you, Guy, here, another old friend, and as a number of you in the room are. I just want to say to Henry's family, it's lovely to see you here. Henry Brooke was one of my dear, dear friends in the law. And he and your mother, Biddy, became great friends of us as a family. And my husband's here tonight because he knew and loved Henry too. And so I just wanted to say it was my pleasure to say yes to being invited to give this lecture tonight. I think of him frequently, of the pair of them. We had many enjoyable evenings together, and I dragged him into all sorts of ventures, I can tell you, and he did likewise to me. So I'm going to talk, I said that I would talk about the state of the world. It was a kind of open thing. If you can leave things a title open enough, it leaves it, when you're invited many months beforehand, it leaves it possible to make some shifts and changes when you get there. Well, my heavens, we've certainly got a state of the world that is worth reflecting on. I remember at the turn of the millennium, I gave a lecture in which I very happily jubilated over the fact that the Human Rights Act had been passed, and I had been campaigning for that for quite a long time, since the late 80s. I also was very elevated about the fact that Pinochet had been arrested. He had been arrested on universal jurisdiction, where Spain had sought his extradition to Spain to try him for crimes he had committed against his own people. And although he ended up, because of ill health, returning to Chile, the principle was established that dictators were not free to roam the world for medical treatment. And Suharto, I'm sure, sitting in Indonesia, and other despots were quite concerned at what they saw happening in the British courts. So I lyrically claimed in this lecture that the 21st century was going to be the century of human rights. Well, I was wrong, and badly wrong. Within a year, we had 9/11, then the Iraq War, and all that flowed since. And so I'm reviewing the state of the world now because my own role has somewhat changed, and I was very much a domestic lawyer here practicing in the criminal courts. I then went to Oxford to be the head of an Oxford college for a number of years. and created an Institute of Human Rights there. And for some strange reason, the International Bar Association thought that I must know all about institutes of human rights and asked me to head up their Institute of Human Rights. So that's what I do now. And so a lot of my work is international. And I'm really going to tonight speak about what I see as being the unraveling of the rules-based order that was created at the end of the Second World War. And I mean, we only have to review the state of the world now. We've got a war in Europe, which is about to become even more devastating and possibly threatening to the whole of the continent. We have a situation in the Middle East, which is utterly hellish and just as frightening in its possible consequences. We have a newly elected president in the United States of America whose worldview has to be alarming to anyone sane, in my view, and whose appointments to vital cabinet posts are really jaw-dropping. We have an almost invisible human catastrophe taking place in Sudan. It hardly gets any coverage. And we have China becoming an ever more powerful entity in the world, as well as a political pendulum which has swung to the right, mainly. I mean, there are populist governments of the left as well, particularly in Latin America. But what goes with populism and populist nationalism usually is authoritarianism, and that is never a respecter of the rule of law. So in my humble view, we're seeing a serious erosion of the rule of law, and it was therefore with some happiness, I have to say, that I saw such a good cohort of law officers being appointed recently to those positions of Attorney General, Lord Chancellor and Solicitor General here in this country. And their commitment, their very public statements of commitment to the rule of law has been reassuring. Now, that might be a nice little bit of optimism, but I'm not going to fill you with optimism tonight because I hope you can accept that we are seeing fewer and fewer areas where there is complete respect for the rule of law. And I think that we should have a little bit of history in order to sort of put it in context. The first time there was a world court was actually after the First World War. And we never really talk about it. It was called the Permanent Court of International Justice, and it was created and it was set up in The Hague, actually, even before the courts that currently exist in The Hague. It was established at the Palais de Paix in The Hague, and ultimately was replaced by our International Court of Justice, which was invented after the Second World War. And it was interesting because that first World Court, it was quite busy in its first iterance. But by the time it got into the 30s, and we saw the rise of Nazism and fascism, it was depleting in the work that it was doing. And it last sat in December 1939. No further judges were appointed, nor was any business dealt with during World War II. But in the midst of World War II, consideration was already being given to a new international political order. So even while the war was going on, there were great brains putting their minds to what was going to be necessary afterwards. In 1942, the United States Secretary of State and the UK Foreign Secretary declared themselves in favour of the re-establishment of an international court after the war. And in 1943, the UK government here, we entertained the we had 19 meetings. We brought together experts from around the world to consider how such a court might be created. And at the end of those 19 meetings, convened here, the Inter-Allied Committee recommended a new court be created based on the same fundamental principles as the League of Nations Court. And the court was ratified by 50 nations when the United Nations was created in San Francisco at the conference in 1945. And so there at the very beginning was that court, a court which currently is really having many nations basically lacking respect for it and failing to live up to its commands. That 51 signatories that signed that, the creation of the court in 1945 grew to 193 in 2020. So really the whole of the globe was signing up. The first case concerned the law of the sea. It involved incidents in the Corfu Channel, and it was brought by us, the United Kingdom, against Albania. But the whole point of the International Court of Justice was that it would be an integral part of the new order created after World War II. And it would deal with territorial disputes, as between states, but also the most grievous of crimes like genocide. It was to resolve disputes between states, not to prosecute individuals. And people often fail to understand that the difference between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice is that the International Court of Justice is the ultimate authority where there are disputes between states. At the same time as the court was being created, Eleanor Roosevelt drew together a whole other set of jurists to consider what sort of global law could be created to prevent the horrendous crimes of the Holocaust ever being committed again. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the incredible product of her endeavours. And it didn't create world law, as she had first of all spoken about wanting to see created, because it was pointed out to her that law had to come out of the traditions and the customs and the belief systems of nations, but to look at the values that were shared that could underpin it, and that you created that template of values against which every legal system would be measured. And so we got that. The right to life, freedom from torture, fair trial and due process, freedom of movement, the right to family life, freedom of association, freedom of religion and belief. You know what I'm talking about. The Council of Europe, another post-war construct, was established to lay the ground for peaceful coexistence across the continent of Europe. And the idea was that it would also, of course, combat communism. It gave rise to the European Convention of Human Rights, which was drafted again here. So much of world law has emanated from here, and we should feel proud of it. It was drafted at Churchill's instigation by David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the Attorney General at the time, and it created the legal framework which would protect human rights. And we fully embraced it in 1998 as part of UK law. We'd signed up to it earlier, but it used to take us, and when I first did a case at the European Court, it had taken 6 years for us to get the case there. Suddenly we were bringing rights home, and it was going to be possible for those issues to be dealt with in British courts. In the years that followed the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were many conventions created to place into treaties the obligations of states with regard to particular individual rights. So we got the Refugee Convention, the Genocide Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Apartheid Convention, the Torture Convention, CEDAW, a convention which was to eliminate discrimination against women, the Istanbul Convention to prevent violence against women and girls, all emanating from the demands from human beings around the world for basically sets of principles that we would adhere to protect each other and to make for a safer and more peaceful world where there would be justice. The laws of war were also altered significantly after the Second World War, because the horrors of the bombings of Coventry and Dresden meant that we revisited the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war. While a nation was entitled to defend itself, such steps had to be discriminatory and proportionate. A people couldn't be starved into submission. Prisoners of war had to be treated with humanity. The 70s saw the creation of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to make human rights a reality, campaigning for political prisoners and monitoring human rights abuses globally. And it was because civil society was taking up the cudgels to protect human rights. Since then, organisations have proliferated, and human rights instruments and charters and laws have taken root, so that you ended up having the Arab Charter of Human Rights, the Canadian Charter, the South African Constitution, there's an African Charter. So these charters of human rights became a way of trying to inform legal systems with values, and values that were shared, albeit that some of those charters haven't enjoyed the full gusto of implementation that we would have liked to have seen. I think particularly of Saudi Arabia, because I was particularly involved, or the Emirates. I've been involved in a number of cases recently, for example, the Jamal Khashoggi murder in Turkey at the hands of state actors on behalf of Saudi Arabia, where we had never seen any proper justice. But the end of the Cold War in the early 90s we saw an extraordinary shift in the tectonic plates of the globe. Now, before we get there, I just want to say that before we get to the 90s, don't get me wrong, there were lots of terrible things. There was the Vietnam War. There was a whole business of, Agent Orange being dropped on people. Adherence to the laws of war was not always going on. We weren't living in some wonderful idyll. But there was a slow, incremental move towards humanizing our systems and expecting and demanding better behavior from nations. The end of the Cold War, I think, was a very interesting shifting point. I mentioned the tectonic plates of the globe. Apartheid in South Africa ended. The juntas of South Africa, most of them fell away. The Soviet Union and its client states surrendered to demands for democracy from their own people. And the market had triumphed. You'll remember Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous book called The End of History. And he soon swallowed that notion when we had the whole business of 9/11, and suddenly the world wasn't looking quite as triumphalist as it had been when he wrote his book. But at that time, what he meant was that the ideas of the West had won, that the ideas of marketplace, of democracy, of individual rights being in there as part of the parcel in the way that they hadn't in communist countries. The battle of ideologies was seen to be over, and both democracy and neoliberal economics had won the day. And so it was a time of optimism. The ICC was created, the International Criminal Court, in 2000, which meant that it wasn't just states that could be brought before an international court. It meant that also individual perpetrators of human rights abuses could be brought to justice. And it's why it became possible to arrest and try someone like Charles Taylor for his crimes in Africa. And he's actually languishing in a prison here in Britain because that's where he's being held and serving his sentence. It's why it's been possible for warrants to be issued against Putin and his Commissioner of Children after the invasion of Ukraine, and the enforced removal of thousands of Ukrainian children, their forcible deportation and displacement into Russia. And I know about this because I'm chairing the task force for the President of Ukraine in relation to that war crime. And it is one of the most shocking things that's happened, but again, doesn't get enough international attention. At the turn of the millennium, by 9/11, the following year, 2001, we were descending, I think, into an era of darkness. The war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iraq war, the consequences of that we're still paying the price for. Guantanamo Bay, a black hole where no law applied at all, and where torture was commonplace. You'll remember Rumsfeld and Cheney and waterboarding, the permission of torture. And you'll remember the scandal at Abu Ghraib and the great democracy involved in all of that. And we ourselves fell into disgraceful practices. The altered advice on the legality of the Iraq war, detention without trial for suspects of foreign origin, the use of evidence which was the product of torture, our involvement in rendition. And thank God we had passed the Human Rights Act, because it meant that we were able to get those cases eventually to our highest court. And we had a bench of such, I think, incredible judges who really understood the meaning of human rights. And so we had decisions made which were highly critical of government policy. I always remember Lord Hope gave an amazing lecture on the history of torture and how rendition was not new in this country, because Henry VIII used to send up people to Scotland, render them to Scotland to be tortured, because Scotland was sort of outside of across the border and had a different legal system, and so torture was done at his behest. It was outsourcing and it actually led to Scotland being the first place in the world that created an anti-torture law. But the good thing at that time was that the government of the day having brought the Human Rights Act into being, did not ignore the judgments of the court. I'm afraid we have more recently failed to see the same sort of respect for the judgment of our Supreme Court, as we saw in the Rwanda business, that a court decided that Rwanda was not a safe place to send people to. And if you knew anything about the history of Rwanda's genocide, the consequences of it, and the continuing war over the border in the Congo, you would realize just how unsafe Rwanda is. And the courts decided that, our Supreme Court did, and the government passed law to say black was white, and that Rwanda was indeed safe. The first 50 years after World War II saw a slow but steady development of the acceptance that the rule of law required respect for human rights. However, since the millennium, we've seen the pendulum swing in the opposite direction. Anti-terrorism became the excuse for the erosion of civil liberties in many Western developed nations. The United States, with its Patriot Act, but also here in the United Kingdom, but across Europe, and nations which looked as though they may have been emerging from totalitarianism became intoxicated with turbocharged capitalism and less enamoured of liberal democracy, and certainly not particularly enamoured of protecting human rights. And you only have to look at the mafia state that Russia has become, or look at what's happening in Belarus, and you can see the problems with injecting a place with certain ideas and never spending enough time on why the rule of law is a vital part of those checks and balances. And the same is true in many Latin American nations, where there may be elections, but they're deeply corrupted, and plutocrats, the super rich, become dictators and are in bed with dictators with whom they share their wealth. Or, as in Venezuela and Bolivia, where there are populist leftist governments and end up, I mean, Nicaragua is the same, you know, which had a left-wing government and it's absolutely authoritarian. And they end up driving a coach and horses through human rights and media freedom. The post-World War liberal consensus was about shared commitments to the rule of law, abiding by treaty obligations, committing to national state structures which provided security for all citizens in times of unemployment, in times of illness, to prevent disease and poverty and homelessness, to provide education and opportunities, to provide homes worthy of heroes. That was what my father was told coming back from the war. But it also involved shared commitments to the protection of minorities. But all this has been slowly fragmented, and it lasted only, I'm afraid, about 25 years, because there was a Hayek moment when nations began to accept a sort of neoliberal economic model of low taxation, deregulation, and low levels of welfare provision. And we've seen that growing, the demands for that. And the whole business has led to low levels, as I say, of welfare provision, and not only spread like COVID across states, but it's also entered global institutions in the world. The World Bank, the IMF, and eventually the European Union all embraced this model, this economic model, which in fact has created huge gaps between the rich and poor. And we now have people who feel above the law. We now have businesses, corporate entities, and those who run them who feel that they are in fact more powerful than nation states, and they are not constrained by law. But when the USA experienced the horrifying 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers and on the Pentagon, all rules were over. Non-state actors did not play by the rules, so why should we? Going into Afghanistan, the hideaway of bin Laden who plotted the airplane attacks, was one thing, but where did the plan to invade Iraq come from? The members of the nexus of evil were singled out as secreting weapons of mass destruction, and no amount of weapon inspections found a scintilla of evidence of such weapons, and no UN resolution was passed to authorise the invasion. And so it began the unravelling of the rules-based order. We knew that totalitarian states were not going to be abiding by the rule of law. But once the USA and the UK, Spain, Australia threw their lot in together as the coalition of the willing, I'm afraid we did start on the famous slippery slope that we all talk about. And so it's no wonder that Putin and now Netanyahu are thumbing their noses at the law and international institutions, including the courts. In the past decade, numerous countries have been involved in wholesale breaches of international law, often involving human rights obligations. And we've seen it, and I see it very clearly in the work that I'm currently doing internationally. The whole business of Russia, and we're seeing something which is a new development, which is transnational oppression, which is, you don't like, you've got some enemies elsewhere, and you poison them. You send out people to eliminate them. And the Iranians are doing it, and we know that the Russians do it, and we had Saudi doing it. You have somebody who's an internal enemy, but you basically can exterminate them wherever they may go. There's going to be no safe place. We also have been seeing in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I started off on the task force that was created to deal with initial war crimes, and the first crimes that I was looking at were the crimes against women and children, and it was from that I ended up being appointed to lead this task force to deal with the children who've been abducted, basically, and taken into Russia. But we've seen Russia's behaviour and disregard for law in its murder of any opposition leader, Nemtsov, Navalny, the arrests of people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, who only recently we managed to get out on an exchange, the jailing and persecution of their lawyers. I was acting for Pavlov, who was Navalny's lawyer, and he now himself has had to flee into exile. And one can't even name where he is for fear that the long arm of Putin will find him. I was with a wonderful journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, only 3 weeks before she returned to Russia. She was writing about what had been happening in Chechnya. She came to Britain to receive a prize for journalism, and she had dinner with a group of us the night of the award, and we tried to persuade her not to return. 3 weeks later, on the front pages of our newspapers, her stairway carried her blood, and it was clear that she'd been shot dead by those who wanted to silence her. So we're seeing these crimes being committed with impunity, and we see the impunity that there is in so many areas. Another area in which I've been working recently has been in China and the whole business of Hong Kong. We saw yesterday the way in which Hong Kong has been penetrated by Chinese lawmaking and the use of the new national security law to imprison people who only wanted democracy, who only wanted to be able to have votes to select those who should stand for them in their representative body. And there they all are. The leader of them, an academic lawyer, getting 10 years imprisonment, and many others jailed for simply wanting democracy and demonstrating to that end. The Jimmy Lai case I've been very involved with because I chair the high-level legal panel on media freedom. And Jimmy Lai was running a newspaper in Hong Kong, and he's now awaiting trial. I mean, he's starting up again any day soon. And he is he's 76. He's likely to die in prison. He's got ill health and diabetes, and he was the owner of a newspaper that was promoting democracy. And that's really, he has done nothing other than attend a vigil in which he held a candle. But they have made their minds up that they're going to close down those who are their critics. And we see it with in Iran. And Mora, who was a great ally in the business of trying to get women lawyers and judges out of Afghanistan, women who'd been, many of them had been left behind, and yet they were on the highest level of the risk registers for our security services. They were recognized as being most in mortal danger. And now I receive calls from them all the time. Most of them are in Canada. I'm afraid we were not generous in the offer that Britain gave to them, to those women. But most of them have been located in Canada. It took a year to get them settled around the world. But they maintain contact with me, and their nieces and their sisters are now living in Afghanistan with no rights whatsoever, unable to work, unable to associate with others, unable to even sing if they can be heard outside of their home. If someone can hear them even singing, then they're committing a crime. No education, and the wretchedness of women's lives there, which is a form of apartheid. But you know all the issues that I'm dealing with. One of the developments that has taken place, and I think is a positive one, is the creation of Magnitsky sanctions. And that's all down to a man called Sir William Browder, who was a banker whose lawyer was murdered in a Russian jail because Bill Browder would not bow to Putin's pressure for basically money. There had been long been sanctions against states, but the introduction of personal liability of individuals for crimes against humanity and human rights abuses was long overdue. And so now it's possible to sanction individuals, and that has been put some teeth into international law. So he has basically won the day in that sanctions have been taken up by the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and the European Union, and are being used against the Russian oligarchs who support Putin and help him in his power-hungry wars. And we've got them against some Chinese functionaries, some warlords, some other monsters, and there should be many more on those lists. But the countries that I have mentioned so far have long histories of despotism, but you also get it now in places where you thought democracy was really going to take hold, like Hungary. And then there was the period in Poland where judges were absolutely under attack and the rule of law being undermined. And in so many places, India, what's happening, the Hindu nationalist populist party is doing terrible things to the Muslim population in India. But we consider Modi a friend, so we pass our eyes over what he does. And then we have the whole business of what's happening to the Palestinians. And I'm afraid today you heard the announcement, and of course it's all presented as anti-Semitism. The evidence of failing to get humanitarian aid to Gaza is a scandal, and it is a crime. It is a crime against humanitarian law. And I can tell you that those warrants, no court is going to grant warrants against a state like Israel unless they see evidence that is persuasive. Now, it's not evidence that is beyond reasonable doubt. That's the conviction level. But they have to examine the evidence and see whether it reaches a level that justifies the issuing of warrants. And that court has now done that today after many, many weeks of consideration of the evidence. And I'm going to put my hands up here and tell you that I was on a panel, which was that the International Criminal Court sought to create a panel to have a second set of eyes to look at the evidence to make sure that there wasn't groupthink or anything going on. It was easy to look at the evidence in relation to Hamas. We know that the atrocities that took place on the 7th of October of last year were absolute atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity, murders of the most terrible kind and sexual and rape and so on. But what we've been seeing happening in Gaza also amounts to war crime. And we should be prepared to say it, even when it is about a strong ally. And it doesn't mean that we cannot have law being applied in some circumstances and not in others. And to suggest that anti-Semitism is the motivator is utterly wrong. So where was the USA and the UK and the rest of Europe over those many years? Until now, I have no doubt that we, as settlements were being created, and that was a breach of international law on the West Bank, where was the action from any of the nations that were supposed to be signatories to those treaties that created the International Court of Justice? And I know that we all share the shame of the Holocaust and what happened. But we mustn't justify, when we said never again, it was not confined to any one people. It meant never again were we going to allow terrible crimes to happen to communities. Now, what is currently happening is, in my view, beyond criminal, and it really makes us complicit if we don't call a halt to it. The ICJ case brought by South Africa accuses Israel of genocide. I wouldn't go that far, but I really do believe that terrible crimes against humanity are taking place, and the consequences of not feeding babies, of having to operate on people without anesthesia, and I saw the evidence of doctors from around the world from around the world. And I saw the satellite evidence that is being used to show the blocking of the convoys of humanitarian aid. And all I can tell you is that there was no shortage of evidence to justify certainly the issue of warrants. I'm afraid that our world is not in a good place at the moment. As I said at the beginning, I was heartened by the appointment of such distinguished lawyers to take on senior roles in our current government. I think we also have a Prime Minister who has the sense to know that the rule of law is fundamental if we're going to improve the world. But we have to brace ourselves and prepare for hard times and serious struggles, because without strong, humane legal structures, democracies fail. And I also think that it's one of the areas where Britain has always been strong and where our voices can matter. But we as lawyers, and most of us in this room are lawyers, we can't be silent. And we can't choose who we decide has broken the law. Thank you. Well,
I think we've got now time for questions, and I think, where's Rev? Have we got some microphones for people? So if you've got a question, can you stick your hand up, but hold it for a second till Yvette gets close to you, and feel free to say who you are. You don't have to say who you are. This is BAILII after all. But just wait for the microphone. Now, who would like to ask a question? In time-honoured fashion, Carl's going to start.
Questions from our
good. Thank you.
Who would like to start? And there must be, yes, here we are. Yeah. I've got a question if we run short, but I'm hoping we'll need it, really.
Thank you, Baroness Kennedy, for a remarkable lecture. I wondered, just bringing things a little closer to home, where the British government's reaction to international courts rulings in relation to the Chagos Islands stands in the spectrum of respect for
in respect to the
Chagos.
Oh, the Chagos Islands. Well, I mean, I frequently have discussions with about this with Philippe Sands, of course, who has been deeply involved in the law in relation to it, and he's optimistic that that they had secured a good result. I don't know whether that will continue to be the case given the outcome of the American election. I don't know what the attitude will be to the base there once we have a Trump administration. I don't know whether that will affect any of the outcomes. But I do think that what happened in relation to Chagos was one of the great scandals of British government. And you'll remember why it was. It happened because we had not taken part in the Vietnam War, and because we were so guilty about not having supported our great ally, the United States of America, in relation to Vietnam, when a base was being sought by our American allies in the middle of the Indian Ocean, we made the Chagos Islands a place available to them. And that was really what the deal was, and that was the basis of it. And while it's important that we are responsive to the needs of our allies and we find ways of doing it, you don't do that at the cost of human lives and of the people who live there, who've been driven off. So I mean, it was a shocking thing that happened in the beginning. But you may correct me and tell me that I've got that wrong.
No. What I was going to ask, though, is the British government's reaction to a judgment saying that that Britain had got it wrong was to say, we don't accept that's right, for quite a period of time.
Absolutely, and it's only just changed recently. And as a result of accepting the court's decision. I mean, I think there's been a greater willingness to accept the court's decision. I mean, we have a bad record on not wanting to accept courts' decisions. I mean, I'll give you another example, which I think is disappointing, was that you'll remember that the European Court made a decision in relation to prisoners' voting rights. Now, one of the I think, distortions of how that is explained to the general public is that we can't have murderers and rapists deciding who should be elected to government. That's something they should be deprived of if they've committed serious crime. But that wasn't what the European Court was saying, that murderers should be given the right to vote. What the European Court said was you can't have an altogether ban on voting because somebody's gone to prison, because there were ways in which that was used, in fact, in communist countries, was that you would have exclusive ban, a complete ban on things. So bans are not liked. And so the idea was that, in fact, so you don't have a ban on it, that it should be reflected by the culture and of the country. And so they leave a margin of appreciation for Britain to decide how they interpret that. We could have very easily just said, everybody who's in prison for up to a year will still retain their right to vote. And for the most part, it would not have caused any great problems inside our system. But we refused to do it. And I felt that it was flying in the face of it, gave the impression to the general public that they were being asked to give votes to murderers and serial killers and so on, when that wasn't true. Because the margin of appreciation allows our courts to reflect the kind of, if you like, the morals and practices of the nation. And that's the situation, for example, on abortion. The European Court will never hold a position on abortion, and it will never hold a position on assisted dying, because they feel that those things have to be decided inside countries themselves. And so, by and large, they give a great deal of leverage to a country in how they interpret things. But there are some things that are fundamental, like torture, like due process, like, and I personally think that the flagging up of wanting us to take us away from international justice is a return to small nationism. It's Little England thinking, and it's not what's going to bring peace and justice in our world. That's how I see it. But I mean, back to your business of the Chagos Islands, I was glad to see us now recognising the judgment of the court, and that we're taking steps to deal with it, which of course are then in the field of diplomacy and how that's worked out.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your words this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here and get the chance to listen to you. And thank you very much to BAILII for organising this tonight. I was interested in your thoughts, and it's linked somewhat, I think, to what you were talking just now about misrepresentation, and which I think we've seen a lot of here in the UK the past few years, whether it's sort of by design or by pure sort of misunderstanding of the operation of structures of international law and the law itself. It seems to have continually built up distrust in our institutions, whether it's presenting participation in those sorts of institutions as ceding power to somebody else rather than an actual participation and contribution to the world order, and how we've seen it fall backwards in the public's sort of trust and understanding, whether it's through the Brexit process or conversations that have led on from that. And I think a lot about how on earth we try and build that trust back up again, and how we combat that sort of incorrect messaging that occurs, whether it's in writing or in spoken word in parliaments or through interviews, and whether you've had any thoughts on how we can combat that.
I'm sure that, I do feel that something extraordinary has happened in our world with the arrival of social media. And there is just no doubt that the ways in which we communicate now, and the ways in which, X and Mr. Musk's great empire is having the most extraordinary impact on public discourse. And you know, it starts online, but it soon has shifted what happens in the public square too. So when we, you know, people feel with the anonymity that they can write horrible things about people, and you know, often are deeply abusive in their, you know, tweets. It's now happening in the public square. And it happens, I mean, I did a report on misogyny for the Scottish Government a couple of years ago now, and it was shocking hearing from, you know, women in public, you know, women who were, you know, on councils and in the Parliament, but it was also girls at school and the stuff that they received. But they also then described how it happened when they were on the bus or on the underground subway going home, and in public places where they would come out of a restaurant with their friends and they would be subjected to abuse of the most horrible kind, and language being used that was incredible. So we've somehow descended into a rather coarsened way of having discussions about things. And I certainly feel that politically, our institutions are being affected by a lot of this stuff too. I mean, it was interesting watching. I mean, it doesn't matter what your politics might be, because it happens on all sides. I mean, it was interesting for me to hear the ways in which it's so easy to attack institutions now. You know, I mean, what we're watching in the United States is a dismantling of many of the institutions that held the thing together. And you know, some of those things do need reforming. We've all been involved at times in our lives in wanting to change things, but we're seeing an incredible disruption, and I think that could easily take hold here too, if we're not careful, because something's in the air, and I think it has been fed by these big monopolies, these big technical monopolies that can do as they please and are unregulated and not in any way kind of constrained by law. And, you know, I mean, there's good law and bad law. I mean, I've spent my life trying to argue for better law. I'm not pretending law is the answer to everything, but you can't exist without law. That's communities from the beginning of time have recognized that. And what we were seeking to do was to have a world that was based on all those good things that we recognize were values that everybody shares. Everybody wants to love and be loved. Everybody wants to live in community with other people. Everybody wants to live free of torture. You know, it's not hard to work out what makes a good life, but we're seeing great sort of, well, we're seeing the creation of hugely rich cohorts of plutocrats who are ending up running countries.
Any other, at the back there.
Thank you for your inspiring speech. It's always an inspiration. Could you sort of explain why it is that amongst all the terrible things you described, there's never been any public condemnation of what happened in Indonesia in 1965? Because in 1 week, in September 1965, 500,000 people were slaughtered with the complicity of the American government and the Royal Navy. And there's never been any sanctions.
You're going to catch me out on all areas of 1965. I'm trying to think. I was still wearing socks at school. So I'm afraid I'm not well enough read to be able to talk about Indonesia in 1965. But I do know that, for example, in Iran in 1988, you know, there was a terrible massacre of students, young people who took to the streets because they wanted democracy, and they were absolutely, they were all rounded up and arrested, and they all ended up being executed. And it's one of the running sores in Iranian society. And in many societies there are those, you know, the collective memory, it has those painful things that are triggered by new events. And so, and that certainly would have been true on the 7th of October of last year, when it happened in southern Israel, in triggering the horrors of what people had experienced within their families. But then, of course, the triggering of all the horrors that Palestinians too have experienced in recent decades. So, you know, one's trying to sort of, if one is going to create a world where we recognize our humanity, then we have to understand that pain is felt in the same way by all of us, whether we're in Sudan or whether we're in Palestine or whether we're in Tel Aviv. It's, you know, and we have to sort of not feel that some people, that there is a hierarchy of peoples, that you know, we're all, you know, we're all part of the same family.
Well, obviously I agree, but the difference is that in Indonesia, there's never been any public admission that these atrocities took place, and there's never been any international condemnation
I'm
of
going
any
to go
kind.
away from here and I'm going to read about Indonesia, but I want somebody else to come in. But, you know, we can document any number of atrocities, and unfortunately they're still going on.
At the back, so our questioners are in clusters here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I would like to salute your struggle to uphold human rights and ask you whether you ever despair of all of it, whether you ever have the feeling that human rights are really a thin veneer that is liable to be shed at the slightest provocation, and plutocracy, war, torture are really incidents of the basic human condition, which is irremediable.
Yeah, no, I don't believe that. I mean, that may make me sound Pollyanna-ish, you know, that I'm some kind of, you know, bright-eyed soul who always sees the best. I don't. But I've learned about human rights from the people that I've represented. I really have. That, if anything, it provides you with the lessons in that. It's the stories of those you act for. And I've seen, I mean, even domestically, when I was doing, you know, a lot of the big Irish Troubles cases, you know, I saw terrible miscarriages of justice. I acted in the Guildford Four, and I acted in a whole set of cases where, which showed me the pain of getting things wrong. And but I still believe that by and large, you know, you can speak to the better parts of people. But at the moment, we're not having that conversation. We're not speaking to the better part of people. And there's something ugly happening in our world just now, and we're going to have to work hard to pull it back. And I think that a lot of it has been about the commitment to making money and to elevating, you know, those values above everything else. And I do think that there's something going wrong. It's like, you know, I can't tell you about Indonesia, but I can tell you a bit about 19th century history in this country. And you know, monopolies. When you have grand monopolies and people becoming super rich, as the owners of railways and factories did at that time, you know, you had to introduce regulation, Factories Acts, to protect people. You had to introduce things to stop monopolies existing and for there to be competition of a real kind between entities, and to try and break it down as old Biden's trying to do just now with Google. Good luck on that. But you know, I do think we're seeing massive monopolies that are now global, and people becoming so super rich that you end up having someone like Elon Musk becoming ultimately unconstrained and more powerful almost than anybody. That's worrying. That should worry us all.
Well, I was hoping for a high note to end on, but
well, maybe we'll get a high note. Anybody got a high note?
Final question over here. Yeah.
Good evening, Baroness Kennedy. Thank you very much for your inspirational speech. A short question: is the European Convention on Human Rights safe now that we've got a Labour government?
Well, I think it'll certainly be safe for as long as Labour's in government, but God knows how long that will be. I don't know. I mean, you know, I do think that these things are fragile, and they're fragile unless we really cling to them and cling to the importance of them. And I really do feel that, that, for example, the European Convention has enriched our law in the United Kingdom. I really believe that. And I think it's made our lawyering better and our judging better than it ever was when I was a young woman. I think our judges, look at her. Anyway, but no, really, I think it has been an enriching experience being involved in it, and I do not want to see it being abandoned.
I was concerned that one of the prospective leaders for the Conservative Party said, I will ditch the European Convention.
Well, he didn't get in, so we had that to celebrate.
Final question here, and then we'll draw it to a close. Yeah. Thank you.
I think a lot of questions were very fancy, but I'm a student. I think a lot of like other young people, as a student, we're very focused on kind of, you know, going about really surviving day-to-day life. And I was just thinking, a lot of young people are concerned over these world issues, and like you mentioned earlier, with the emergence of social media and everything, I think a lot of conversations between people exist on social media, and we, you know, there's all sorts of conversations happening, like about Palestine and Gaza, and, you know, and to wealth disparity, to Elon Musk and Trump appearing in some UFC fights and stuff. But I've always felt that conversations happening in online doesn't always transition to conversations happening in offline, and being here and listening to all about these atrocities, too, very good other stuff too. What can we do just as, you know, students or people living day-to-day life? Like,
Well, I just think that we have to, when we see terrible things happening, we have to use whatever influence we can, and that sometimes can mean, it sometimes does mean demonstrating. It sometimes means standing outside of the Chinese embassy and letting it be known that we're not happy with what they're doing to the Uyghur and what they're doing in Hong Kong. And I just think that we have to find our ways of giving voice and not being silent and not being cowed into silence when we see terrible things happening. And, you know, I feel very saddened by the business of the Middle East, because I'm married to a Jewish man. I have great close relations, friends in Israel, and I still feel that I will not allow someone to say that I am an anti-Semite because I am concerned about what's happening to the women and children of Gaza who are being slaughtered. And I'm not happy about the fact that we are allowing malnutrition to set in and disease. And so I feel that to be silenced is utterly disgraceful and not part of the kind of debate that we should be having in our society about bad things that happen around the world. But our young, I hope, will have the courage to make up for the rest of us. So there. Now, I'm sure that, are there any?
We do have someone who would like your comments on the UN Convention on the Children's Convention, Rights of the Child, and its effectiveness.
Well, I mean, one of the sad things about it is that I'm really pressed up against that just now, doing the work that I'm doing in relation to the Ukrainian children that have been taken into Russia. I mean, we're talking about, the numbers are very difficult to really pin down because data is poor in the former Ukraine. In Ukraine, many of the children have been taken from institutional care because institutional care was so much the way of doing things, and there was very little foster caring in Ukraine. So many of the children were taken either from hospitals or from institutions. There are children where there were family problems, where the mother might be seriously ill or had mental health problems, and those children have all disappeared into Russia. And you can have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's any number of protections for children and the protection that should be required in war. But I'm telling you, it's meaningless when people don't care about law. And so all I can say is that, we do have a pretty good developed legal system with regard to the care of children. It's not true in all places. And so I actually would like to see Britain being much more proactive on the rights of the child. And it's interesting that Wales is probably even more effective in Wales than in other parts of the United Kingdom. But so to your questioner, I would like to see a much more vigorous support of the rights of the child, because the care system in Britain has taken a lot of suffering recently too, with the privatisation efforts. So. But listen, I just want to raise hope. I do want to say that as I go around, I'm very involved with further and higher education. And when I go and speak to the young, I always come away feeling heartened, because they really do care about their fellow human beings. They really care about a peaceful world and the future of the universe and the climate and so on. And so I do not give up hope. I believe that these things can be mended and that we're capable of mending them, but it means eternal vigilance. That's how we guard justice. Thank you.
Well, let me just draw things to a close. Actually, I'll stand up because I've got to thank a few people, and if you do that sitting down, it sort of looks as if you don't quite mean it. I should just say briefly, I'm Guy Beringer, the chair of the trustees of BAILII. Let me start by thanking our host, A&O Shearman, well, first of all, for letting me back in, which is very gratifying, but also for laying on this facility for us, and for, I hope, giving us something to drink in a moment, and I won't detain you from that too long, outside. So thank you for them and their generosity. But my most particular thanks to Helena for coming tonight for a whole host of reasons. One is she isn't well, so I was sort of watching and trying to step in to sort of stop her for her own good, but she's determined to go on. Most people probably would have dropped out. She did not, and we're deeply grateful to her. We're most particularly deeply grateful because I do know that she will be besieged by requests from organizations relating to access to justice like us, of whom there are many, to come and speak to them. We're extremely grateful that she decided to come and speak to us, because I know you're deluged by these invitations, which are on top of all the other things you do day to day. So thank you for an inspirational speech. Thank you for taking the trouble to prioritize us. And keep going, actually. So I think the world does need people like you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, the other thing I was going to just go back to was more sort of the beginning, that BAILII is a charity, so you know what's coming. You may think it odd that an organization would celebrate its 24th birthday. It is slightly odd. But in the access to justice world, actually making it from one year to the next is frankly a cause for celebration. These are difficult times. If you think this is sort of bigging it up, wait for our 25th birthday next year. But there's a QR code there, which is wishing BAILII a happy 24th birthday. For those of you able to access a QR code, please do so. We've got a number of supporters here. We have our law firm supporters and chamber supporters. We're very grateful to you. Please keep going. There will be a number of people here who are not yet supporters. Please do consider supporting us. Our model is a crowdfunding model. It's a series of supporters at a relatively low level, which has the advantage that we don't depend on anyone. We used to get support from the government, but they stopped for a variety of reasons, quite suddenly, actually, as they're wont to do. So we do need more supporters. And if you want to know anything, if you want to know whether your organization is currently supported, just come and ask me or Yvette around at the back, and we'll tell you. And if you want to ask them, might they support, we will help you. But do please give that some thought. Have a look at the QR code, and do try to help us, either yourselves or through the organizations you're associated with, or through other introductions. So that's enough for me. There is a drink outside. Let me finally go back again and thank Helena for a wonderful talk and for actually seeing it out. We're deeply grateful to you, but I think in your own interest, we've got to get you off the podium soon. A round of applause to finish off, and then see you again.